Morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk to you about the pelvis. Now, aside from the health coaching side and everything that I do there, I'm a neurosomatic therapist, and people often wonder what that is, what that means. I want to break it down for you. So, neurosomatic. So, neuro is, the brain, the nervous system, the eyes, how does the body receive information? That's the neuro part, right? The cranium, the C1, C2, right? What's going on a neurological standpoint? And then somatic is body, right? What's going on with muscles, soft tissue, ligaments. In the neural part, we also focus on organs, right? Because there's something called a viscerosomatic reflex, which is where organs reflex into muscles. If a woman is menstruating, oftentimes they're complaining about low back pain, right? We know the uterus is reflexing into the low back, so they put a heating pad on their low back, right? The uterus has all this energy because energy cannot be, created or destroyed, only transformed. So all this energy that the uterus is creating gets moved to the muscles of the back and, expel this heat, right? You feel all this heat, all this muscle tension going on back here. Now, today, in neurosomatic, we focus on the pelvis and the C1, C2, the cranium. What's going on at the top and the bottom of the spine. And the reason we focus on that is because so many people focus on the spine itself, the vertebrae. And, those are relatively small muscles moving those bones. Our philosophy, or at least the way I look at things, are, here's the pelvis, and we have a lot of very large musculature that attaches to it, such as the quads, you have the hip flexors, you have the glutes, adductors, right? They attach right in the anterior portion. And these muscles are very big and strong depending on someone who's doing athletic activity, right? Or, whatever activity that they are doing. And, if one side gets tighter than the other, which is often the case because in many sports, they're on one side. Baseball, it's a one-side swing. Hockey, usually one side. Gymnasts or dancers tend to have one leg that they land on. That can cause a lot of, things in the hip, right? And when we see something that I see very often, something called a pelvic torsion, which is where one quad or adductor is tighter than the other, we get something like this that happens in the pelvis, right? This ASIS, or the other one gets pulled downwards. And when that happens, when we get this torsion effect, we see what happens to the sacrum and the spine, right? We see this rotation that happens. So, you go to a chiropractor or some, soft tissue expert, and they're trying to push this back into place. They're coming, on your backside, and they're trying to adjust the sacrum to get that back. And in essence, they may get it back, but they're fighting all the tension from the musculature that pulled the ilium out of place in the first place. So as a neurosomatic therapist, we really focus on posturology and looking at the entire body. If you have pain in your low back, I'm looking at your knees and your feet, possibly looking at your neck. If you have pain in your shoulders, what's going on in your neck, what's going on in the opposite pelvis or ilium, what's going on in the opposite knee, opposite foot, right? You want to have an idea as to how fascia helps all these muscular chains connect, and then how does that implement with the movement patterns that you're doing, whether you're a dancer or a hockey player, or you're sitting at a desk all day with your right hand forward, touching your mouse. So many times I see shoulder issues or rotation patterns, and I'm like, oh, you sit at a desk, is your mouse on your right hand or your left hand? And usually it's the hand that's further forward, because when they stand up, they're also still rotated forward, right? And you're doing this pattern for hours and hours a day. And so really focusing on, what movement patterns are you doing on a daily basis that's contributing to your pain. But really quickly, I wanted to talk about the pelvis and what can happen. So oftentimes we see something called an anterior pelvic tilt. So if we're looking at it from the side, right, an anterior pelvic tilt is where you're standing and your pelvis is tilted forward, right? So on me, that would be if your pelvis looks something like this. So most people kind of walk with their butt out. And then we sometimes see a posterior pelvic tilt, which is where it's tucked under, kind of like this. And then you get this arching through, the upper back. So those are the two basic ones that a lot of people know about, right? Anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt. Now, anterior pelvic tilt is the more common one because what happens is your hip flexors, right? Your hip flexors attach to your lumbar spine. They attach to here, they travel down through your abdomen and onto your femur. Now, when you're sitting in this, position all day, this is a seated position, right? Because the leg continues out this way. So you have your hip flexor, which goes from here, your psoas, and it comes all the way up to the lumbar spine. And then you go to stand up, which is this leg straightening. The pelvis or the lumbar spine starts to follow it forward as well. And when it follows it forward, we get this pulling on the lumbar spine, and oftentimes our quadratus laborum muscles, which are right here, fire up, and all of a sudden, boom, we have some back pain. So how do you address that? Well, you got to figure out what's pulling, the pelvis forward. Is it the quads because the quads are tight? Is it psoas, right? Oftentimes people have never had their psoas released, and that's the key to all their back pain. Another thing with anterior pelvic tilt is your rectus abdominis, specifically your low abs, strong enough to stop the pelvis from rotating forward, right? Your rectus abdominis attaches right here on the top of your pubic bone. Now, if it's weak, right, because most people are bloated and have weak abs, the pelvis rotates this way. If it was strong, it would help pull this up. But people eat crappy food. They like to drink. They don't really take care of their gut. And so when these organs get inflamed, they tell the rectus abdominis to relax. And when it relaxes, it lets the organs, breathe a little bit more. But as your rectus abdominis relaxes and there's more breathing that's happening in those organs, the pelvis goes this way and boom, you're in pain. Now, other things that can happen. If we were talking about some unilateral exercises like I was talking about earlier, such as hockey or baseball or things that are, one-sided, you're doing the same thing, the same pattern all the time, we start to see this torsion effect, which is where the iliums get pulled out of alignment and we get this rotation of the SI joint and therefore a small rotation in your lumbar spine. The problem there is that you have ligaments, sacral ligaments, that go right in here between, the spinous process and then our iliums. Now, oftentimes your back pain, or the SI pain that people have is right in here because things are, twisted and being pulled out of alignment. Now, what we focus on is, what is the pelvis telling us? Is there a torsion? Is there a tilt from a tight QL, right? Which sits right here, quadratus laborum. Okay, it's your body's natural safety belt. Now, when tight, it can do this, right? So now we see that the hips are out of alignment. And when the hips are off, which is evidence, if you look at your underwear line or your pant line, you'll see that it can be tilted. We often see that mirrored upstairs in the shoulders where now you're like this. So the question is the trap tight or is it just the pelvis that's off and the body's compensating somehow? So this is why we look at the entire system. Now, you can also have something called a obliquity. An obliquity is where the ilium can actually have an in-flare and an out-flare. So you can have somewhere where the iliacus and psoas is tight and it's pulling this ilium inwards, and then this side gets flared outwards, right? You see that? You see how the spine stays in the middle and one is in and one's out? See that? So, if you have an in-flare or an out-flare, you may feel like one leg is shorter than the other, or someone has told you that before, but it really just messes with, how the femoral head sits in the acetabulum, and we can see that shift start to happen, right? My hands are staying level, but we're seeing one femur get shorter and that obliquity being created. So we have, tight iliacus psoas on the in-flare, and we have a tight glute med on the out-flare, and it's pulling the pelvis out of alignment, which obviously comes from some sort of habitual pattern or, poor motor programming or poor sitting or, always crossing one leg, right? There's some sort of habit that's causing that, which is where we look to figure out what's causing it. But those are a little bit harder to fix because we have so many muscles that are working at pulling this in and then this side out. And anytime you're addressing the pelvis, you also have to address the muscles of the leg because, everything from the upper thigh to the lower leg to the foot will affect the pelvis. And so, working with something as simple as some low back pain, in order to address it long term and to really get rid of the problem, so you got to look at feet. You have to look at, if there's a tibial torsion, where is the knee tracking during gait. It's a process. And you know, if you're only looking at the back and trying to adjust bones, you're not getting the whole picture. And so oftentimes that's why people are still in pain after seeing, you know, your typical chiro physio. And not that they're bad people, there's just a different perspective of looking at things. You got to get the whole picture, right? And as a holistic health practitioner, we really focus on, you know, food and organ health and how that correlates to muscle function, because every organ can reflex into muscle. So oftentimes people that I work with who are in, you know, chronic pain from, you know, tissue stuff or joint stuff, you have to address how much water are you drinking, you know, what type of food are you eating, and that's not even to talk about the mental emotional stuff that's involved as well. You know, any girl with anxiety will probably have gut issues, or any individual you know, suffering anxiety will probably have some gut issues, because they feel like they got like this like gut feeling, and all of a sudden their digestion goes out of whack, and back pain or tight psoas is what's next. So, you know, you have to correlate things together. So to recap, you can have an anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt. You can have a pelvic torsion, left or right. You can have a tilt from a tight QL, or you can have this in flare or out flare, right? So lots of opportunity to figure out what's going on. You got to address, is it psoas? Is it the quad, you know, the quad grouping that's attaching to the ASIS? Is it the adductor series, which is attaching to the front of the pelvis? Are the glutes just really, really weak or dysfunctional and causing, you know, all type of hip dysplasia because, you know, someone has, let's use the example of gymnasts or dancers. Generally, they're hypermobile. They have a lot of, you know, their tendons and ligaments are a little bit looser. So joints can move easier, which is why they're so mobile. But when you treat them or work with them, you actually find that their muscle tone is so strong, right? They're so tense, yet they're mobile. And the reason for that is because the ligaments are loose, the muscles tighten up to try to take up the slack in the joint. And that's why dancers or gymnasts are always stretching, and it makes things a lot worse because they're creating more ligament laxity. And you actually need to get them weight training and strength training to actually help strengthen up those ligaments to get the joints to stay strong so that they stop going out of place and causing pain. I hope that was informative for you guys. If you have any questions about the pelvis, or, you know, pain you're having in your knees, ankles, shoulders, hips, back, drop me a line. Usually it has something to do with the pelvis. I'm going to do one tomorrow on the cervical spine and how it correlates with the pelvis and why you have to work on both of them. Hope you guys have a great day.